Well, on behalf of the committee, I'd very much like to welcome you and thank you for appearing in person as well as virtually to give evidence this afternoon. This is the first time that Dr. Radomir Tylecote and Miss Georgina Wright have appeared before this committee to give evidence, and we look forward to hearing from you. This is the final session of our inquiry into PESCO and UK-EU defence cooperation, and I hope and very much expect that you will provide the committee with different and valuable views on the various areas we have previously explored. So before we start, and for those watching at home, could you be kind enough to introduce yourselves? And perhaps we could start with you, first of all, Mr. Dr. Tylecote.
Thank you very much. I'm Dr. Radomir Tylecote, the Managing Director of the Legatum Institut. Thank you.
And Georgina Wright?
Hello, I'm Georgina Wright. I'm the Europe Director at the French think tank Institut Montaigne, and I'm also a visiting fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, which is a US think tank.
Thank you very much. And you're speaking from Paris, is that right? Thank you
Absolutely.
very much indeed. So I'll ask the first question, which is as follows, and I'll address this first of all to Dr. Tylecote. What added value, if any, does PESCO provide for the European continent's military capabilities?
Thank you very much for the question. I think PESCO stands to provide some added value in the practical sense, and I'm sure that we will dive in due course into the possibility of military mobility, which obviously has some potential practical benefits. But I would draw attention to the assumption behind the question that PESCO does have net added value. PESCO originates in the Lisbon Treaty, although it obviously came into being in 2017, and so is a part of an overall project towards the centralisation and the harmonisation of defence on the European continent. So I think that the UK policy makers in general should be wary, is my overall top line, of even ad hoc cooperation with and in PESCO-led projects. And just by way of example, although the UK position, government position, springing from the Political Declaration 2019, is that participation would only be on an exceptional basis in PESCO. We have received warnings, for example, from the former CEO of the EDA, that have stated that any third-party involvement in PESCO would, by implication, lead to the support by a third-party country of the common security and defence policy. So my overall take is that we should be careful of claims of net added value.
Thank you. Georgina Wright, please.
I think I sort of broadly agree. I think the context is very important to why PESCO came to being. It, yes, takes its root in the Lisbon Treaty, but it was really 2017 with Crimea, and we saw rising cyber threats, hybrid threats. And also it was in the context of greater EU and NATO discussions about what added value could the EU have, how could the EU take on greater responsibility for European security and defence, and how could it complement NATO. And most, as you will know, all member states are members of PESCO now, apart from Malta, and a majority of those want to make sure that PESCO does not in any way duplicate what NATO does. So it's really to complement NATO, and I agree some projects of PESCO do that, and we'll, I'm sure, get into the military mobility project, but there are others as well. I think it's also important to think back to 2017, where member states weren't quite sure how much they wanted to spend on defence. It was this constant battle also within NATO and with the Americans saying, how can we get Europeans to spend more? And so this was also a way to get member states to promise to spend more, to work towards more joint planning. but always with the underlining acknowledgement that defence is a national competence. So even if there is a legally binding commitment that says that member states promise to spend more and do more together, it cannot be enforced. And I think we've seen I was counting today 68 projects, and some with mixed results, but there is this possibility of renewing or reviewing them every 2 years. And I think the geopolitical context today, when we have a United States, potentially a return of a president who has questioned the US's involvement in European security, I think it warrants a really good discussion on how the EU can complement what NATO does. And I think that's why having the UK part of that discussion, all the while making the decision on when it's in its own interest to participate in PESCO projects, is a good thing. And I'm really glad the committee is holding this session today.
Thank you very much. May I just ask a supplementary to that? Do you see the situation in the European continent at the moment sufficiently a matter of concern because of all the activities that are going on in Ukraine and throughout the rest of the world, in fact, which gives special reasons for being insistent that NATO has to be at the heart of this, and that anything that PESCO does would effectively be an adjunct to it? In other words, I want to nail down this simple question. NATO comes first, does it not, as compared to ancillary activities which may or may not be beneficial? Radomir, please.
Thank you for that. So the overall sense that I think most people get from the Western response to the Ukraine, which is that there was a change of habit in British leadership, and I refer in particular to the previous Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who was able to act independently and was no longer a part of a culture that expected him to refer to Brussels before I think it's fair to say leading the Western defence of the Ukraine and setting the pace. So I think the conclusion to be drawn from the continuing Russian invasion of Ukraine is probably not the continuing centralisation of defence policy in Brussels is going to improve the European defence situation. However, you asked about does NATO still come first? And I think the answer to that is yes, but I also think there is now a risk, partly because of the European Defence Fund and other aspects of European defence harmonisation, that this will not always be the case. And I'd like to draw your attention to two particular themes that I think are worthy of this committee's consideration. These are, in my view, likely to undermine the effectiveness of NATO in the years to come. The first is that in the 2021 regulation establishing the EDF, in Articles 23 and 20, which I won't go into ad nauseam, the meaning of these effectively is that if one of the 25 nations that cooperate within PESCO is funded by the EDF and wishes to transfer ownership over one of their PESCO projects to the UK or the United States, which obviously could be perceived as having different security interests, then you would have a 100% effective tax on any funding that had been granted via the EDF. So this is not only potentially protectionist, but it would seem to hinder NATO-oriented defence R&D and planning. And the next point that I think will call into question whether NATO comes first by European Union members is that Lisbon gave the EU its own version of NATO, Article 5 on collective security, and we see that in Article 42, which is a collective defence obligation that appears to have binding legal effect, and I think the committee should take this very seriously. Could this be legally superior to the mutual defence commitment in Article 5? That needs to be understood to understand why or whether EU countries will continue to see NATO as the first port of call.
Thank you very much. Georgina, Wright?
I mean, sitting in Paris, I absolutely see no risk of the EU becoming the new NATO. That's, And I say this from a country, sitting in a place where they really do push for EU defence. I mean, I think for every European member state that's a NATO ally, NATO is the bedrock of European security. If you look at France's national security strategy that it published in 2022, it made that clear as well. And I think, if anything, the war in Ukraine showed that this was really a NATO moment more than an EU moment. But it was a wake-up call for the EU, which was, what can we do, A, to take more responsibility for European security and defence? And there are, you will know this, there's been a step up in coordination with NATO. And in particular, what can we do to support NATO? Where can we be, diligent, and where can we act where it's perhaps more difficult for NATO to do so? And that's, of course, I'm thinking of the PESCO mobility project, but also where we can finance and support Ukraine. There were lots of developments there, but also how can we support the EU defence market as well? So how can we support member states that want to ramp up arms productions? And I think on the protectionist element, I think, of course, this is something that the UK, but also Canada and the United States will be paying very close attention to if they are asked to join a PESCO project, is to what extent do they have access to this intellectual property? What does it mean concretely for third country participation? But I think the protectionist element only really concerns PESCO projects that are funded in some way by the European Defence Agency, and that's not the case for all PESCO projects. So I think that, it's due diligence. If you're going to participate in something, if you're a company, that's what you do. You look at everything, you look at the conditions. And I think this geopolitical context, it matters, particularly given the US election. I think the EU has at times been inflexible, but everyone recognises the crucial role and the key role that the UK has played in responding to Russia's aggression of Ukraine. And I think there might be flexibility as well, even in the design of projects, if the UK and the EU see this project as, helping or supplementing NATO in some way, and potentially the EU giving space to the UK to participate in the design of that project. But that would absolutely be up to the UK government to decide whether or not it's in the UK's interest to do so. But I really don't think we need to worry about the EU somehow supplanting NATO. I just don't see that happening.
Thank you very much. David Jones, and then another question to follow.
Yes, you mentioned, Ms. Wright, that you don't think that PESCO has the potential to supplant NATO. To what extent would it have the potential to impact, whether positively or negatively, the UK's strategic autonomy in defence? And you also mentioned France earlier. To what extent is the potential for maybe improving bilateral relations with major European players? Because previously we have, of course, participated in joint missions with the French. Is there potential for that to continue? Or does PESCO intrude on that?
Shall I respond?
Yes, please.
Yes. I mean, you can absolutely do both at the same time. It's happened in the past and it will continue to do so. And I think the war in Ukraine was really the catalyst that brought the UK and France closer together. And we've seen governments working much closer together, the armies working much closer together, and, sort of seeing the UK participate in PESCO projects in the future would not mean in any way a diminishing of Franco-British defence cooperation, or for that matter, UK defence cooperation with groups of EU countries or other EU countries on a bilateral basis. So I really don't think that that's a problem. And my hope really is that France and the UK do more together. And when I travel to Germany, or I travel to Poland or Italy, there's often, people often ask me, well, what's happening between France and the UK? Are they going to announce something? I think there have been some missed opportunities these past 2 years, and I really hope that we will see these two countries do more together, because they don't always come to the same conclusions. There are lots of things that they disagree on, but they share broadly the same strategic culture, same size of army, and same experience as well. And I think they have a lot to learn from each other, and European security would be better off if France and the UK did more together.
I would like to just come in on that, if I may, before the next question. What President Macron was talking about in the last 48 hours, is somewhat out of line with what you just said, perhaps, because after all, if we were to be putting boots on the ground in Ukraine, that would be a massive difference of opinion, not just a sort of minor adjustment. Could you like to comment on that? Because he was quite specific, and he's also been pretty well slapped down.
Well, he's also been sat down in France. I think so. One thing is the Franco-British defence relationship is about much more than the relationship between the French president and the British Prime Minister. And I know you know this, but I think it's worth reminding. Second, I think Macron's comment was taken slightly out of context. If you listen to the whole press conference, which is what I did, he said at some point we cannot preclude, or we cannot say from right now that there will be no boots on the ground. He didn't mean sort of engaging in conflict, but he meant sort of helping perhaps put missiles in place or whatever it was to help the Ukrainian army. But he certainly didn't say this is what we've decided together. The purpose of that conference was really to acknowledge the fact that Europeans needed to do much more to support Ukraine. Frankly, I think it's a good thing that President Macron did this, because at the start of the war, he was a bit slow, and definitely France was not doing what the UK was doing. So I think it's very good that he convened this conference. Unfortunately, he didn't deliver significant pledges, which I think had been the hope at the start. But I really think that was the focus, is what can we deliver? How quickly can we deliver it? And if we have sophisticated weaponry that requires skilled workforce, or people understanding how to use it, might we be able to support the Ukrainian army with that? And that was the context of what he said. It was not, I, the president of France, will decide on behalf of everyone that there will be, boots on the ground. And I think it's important to give that context. But Macron's problem sometimes is that he says things and he forgets that nuance can be lost, because when you talk for a very long time, it's only normal for people to just jump on certain things. So he needs to work more on his strategic communications, I think.
First of all, David Jones.
Yes, Dr. Tylecote, do you think that PESCO has the potential to impact, whether positively or negatively, on the UK's strategic autonomy? And how do you feel about more bilateral arrangements with potential EU allies?
So, I think that the risk to UK strategic autonomy is probably best analysed through the lens of the military mobility question. But I would like to allude to a couple of things that Ms. Wright has said. I'm not the first person to observe that the attitude of the Élysée Palace to both NATO and the Ukraine can be typified as somewhat enigmatic, and I don't claim to understand the exact rationales of what President Macron has just said. That said, whether Franco-British collaboration in the defence sphere improves will be down to the administrations in both countries. We have, however, seen continuing strong bilateral defence cooperation by the UK, including with France, and that's shown in the Lancaster House Agreement of 2010. But that was a part of a British approach that prioritised the ad hoc and the bilateral over the multilateral, and I think this was maintained to a degree through our membership of the European Union. Why has there been such a strong concern in this country that this should remain the case? I think what we're getting towards here is a fundamental philosophical concern, which is the existence of a state is understood to depend on the monopoly on violence, among other things. And if that monopoly on the use of force begins to drift towards unelected bodies in Brussels, I think we are increasingly asking whether European states remain viable, and I don't want to speculate too far, but I think this awareness is one of the things that is going to bog down PESCO, and is another reason why members of PESCO are not meeting their binding commitments, so 2% spending, data sharing, and so on, and I'm happy to submit more written evidence on that point. I think continued UK interest in even third-party affiliations and PESCO-led projects, and military mobility is, of course, a project that arises from PESCO and exists to continue the development of the common security policy, are also likely to distract this country from, in my view, more useful defence partnerships such as AUKUS and building AUKUS. So overall, I think that's my take.
You mentioned AUKUS, but the United States seems quite comfortable with participation in military mobility.
It does, and I think NATO is also comfortable with the European Union going ahead with this project. And the current view in NATO is that it's better done within the EU, although we should very strongly support NATO, and even more than we have done in the last 10 years. It doesn't mean that what NATO does and says is necessarily gospel, and I think what we need to be alert to is not just the risks for sovereignty that are presumably contained within the administrative agreement, which we need to be able to see. It's that there might be, even though NATO's intentions are good, there might be some kind of opportunity cost here for NATO. So if we become accustomed to the EU developing military mobility, what else does that mean? Does that mean that there is defence funding, R&D funding that is channeled through the EDF for this project that then has strings attached, that then has protectionist elements that I've alluded to? So I think it's not that NATO is necessarily wrong or the United States is necessarily wrong, but what is beginning as a limited project in this case is always liable to come with strings attached. I think that's the main caution.
Okay, thank you.
Did you want to ask another question?
No, that's
fine. So, Greg Smith, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Dr. Tylecote, you just referenced the EDF, the European Defence Fund, in your answer. Can you expand a little bit more on the implications for the EU defence funding programmes like the EDF to the United Kingdom, particularly given the number of defence contractors that we already have in the United Kingdom that clearly serve a global market, including the continent of Europe? What was going to be the practical outrun of this if UK defence contractors are essentially frozen out?
Thank you. I'd return to some of the indications that have been appearing since 2019 to 2020 that EDA and EDF participation are likely to imply support for other PESCO aims like CSDP. I think it's worth pondering a couple of examples of protectionism that we're seeing arise, and that's it's worth investigating intellectual property controls, particularly where non-EU countries will be unable to access IP that is ultimately European Union funded. And you mentioned defence corporates and investment, and I think it's also reasonable that the United States has noted the emergence of what it calls a bi-European preference. Part of this is because of ITAR, so ITAR meaning International Traffic in Arms Regulations. This is a US set of regulations whereby non-US companies need prior approval for the re-export of sensitive material, and European procurement seems to be increasingly excluding ITAR-restricted products from procurement. What does this demonstrate? The EU model inherently involves the harmonisation of technological standards, and it now involves the harmonisation of defence IP. I think what the last generation or so has taught us is that European prosperity over the last 300 years was based on competition between companies, and it was based on competition between nation states in terms of technological standards, in terms of business law and so on, and this allowed our economies to grow and improve. The fact that the defence area, including R&D, is now being harmonised around one unified European set of standards, I think, is inherently anti-competitive and likely to slow growth. So I would also suggest to the committee that we shouldn't take our eye off that ball. There are fundamental questions for European defence and sovereignty directly, but there are also questions about future growth and prosperity and this continuation of the European model.
Georgina, Wright, do you have something to add to that?
Yes, I think it's important to make the difference there are different kinds of PESCO projects, right? There are those that sort of centre around research and development and procurement, and there are absolutely questions about how intellectual property is shared and used. And I think that's been voiced. So, it was voiced at the time when the UK was a member state, and it has been put forward by other third countries that would like to participate in projects. Again, I think the geopolitical context is such that there might be flexibility to talk to the EU about certain these conditions. And in any case, I think the UK government should only ever agree to take part if it feels fully confident with what is put forward on the table. But then you've got other PESCO projects, such as the mobility project, that don't have those same concerns, because it's about basically facilitating the movement of troops or defence equipment across Europe. And that's why Canada and the United States, but also the UK, would like to take part. I also think the other thing that we need to remember is the EU, and especially on defence, this isn't the sort of European Commission imposing things. This is very much member state-led initiative. And for example, every PESCO project is led by a member state. The role and involvement of the EU Commission is quite limited. And I think it's really there to support rather than guide and prescribe the way that the projects should be done. And I think that's also because within the EU, you've got 27 member states, and a number of them, if not a majority of them, don't want to see the EU duplicate what NATO does, and say this repeatedly. So I think we need to, when we look at a project, if I were the UK government and I'm looking at a project, I'm sort of thinking, does this meet, what added value does it bring, and how will I be involved? What's expected of me, and what can I get out of it? And I think just to, bounce back on the ITAR component that was just discussed, and why the EU is perhaps trying to not use ITAR components. Well, it's also because we've seen the reach of US extraterritorial norms, which means that basically any project that uses an ITAR component or uses a software that comes from ITAR, then the US company, in fact the US government, can determine where that product goes. And I think for a European company, then it becomes much more difficult, because they don't have full freedom to decide who they sell to or where they can export their goods, because they would always need the approval from the United States. So I think it really is actually in a way to simplify processes and to grant European companies a maximum level of freedom in deciding how they export products that they produce.
Would it not be fair to say, particularly with the example of the European Defence Fund, that it's almost blind to the reality of how defence innovation happens, that it doesn't, in broad terms, happen in one country? And most of the contractors and the innovators in this space operate across the Atlantic as much as they operate across the English Channel and into the continent. And if you're locking out one area and saying we're not going to play with anyone else, that's going to lead to a two-tier NATO and a very mismatched set of defence requirements and an equipment base within the alliance. Ms. Wright?
Oh, sorry. I mean, there are risks, but these are, and it's absolutely the right question to ask, and it's a question that we hear over and over again in Brussels. And I think you saw Macron move this week on, for example, he'd been pushing very heavily on any EU funding that we use for defence should only be used to buy, EU-based or EU-produced equipment. And he let go of that after the conference, because other member states pushed back and said, this is mad. We need, the best we need to be thinking about the defence market, the best way that we can, for it to be competitive, how we can produce quickly at low cost, and how we can promote innovation, and restricting it would be a bad idea. And so France has moved on that. And I think a number of member states would agree with what you've just said. And I think, and I would hope that that the EU would be open to discussing that with its allies, even those with whom it doesn't have a defence partnership as such.
Thank you.
You wanted to come in, Mr. Jacks?
Chairman, thank you. Well, yes, I may be jumping in to the next question. I hope I'm not. Georgina, we've just come back from Italy, where we visited the Joint Force Command in Naples, because I sit in the Defence Committee with another member, Gavin Robinson. And it was clear from all we saw, and we had a pretty top secret brief, that NATO is not ready at all for a major conflict, God forbid, with Russia or another peer adversary. And as I'm sure you'd admit, Europe is now facing the most serious challenge on security that we've faced since probably the end of the Second World War. Trump, if he gets back in, has consistently said, whatever you think of the man, has consistently said that the NATO countries must pay their dues. I think I'm right in saying the Americans paid about 75%. The contribution of NATO, the American contribution is about 75%. We pay 2%. Very few other countries in NATO do. The PESCO project is without doubt going to, do not think, detract from NATO, however you like to dress it up. And surely the top priority now is to get NATO, including members, of course, like France, to really gear up on the NATO commitment before they start thinking of going down anything like a PESCO route. Would you agree with that, or?
I mean, I think that would be a real concern if PESCO were trying in some way to become a new NATO, but it's not, right? The projects, and I think over the next 2 years, because we have every European country has said that it wants to increase its defence budget, there are going to have to be choices that will need to be made. I mean, we need to support the defence industry, but there are a number of other priorities that governments need to spend money on. And so I think actually this will be up to, in the design of each PESCO project, and you will know that not every member state takes part in the PESCO project. It really isn't, you choose whether or not it meets kind of your, whether it meets your requirements, whether you see interest in participating. And we're not talking about the same levels of funding. And that's also one of the problems with many of PESCO projects, is just they're underfunded, they're a bit slow. And I think we're several years on now where the EU can make an objective assessment about where is the added value, where is there no added value. And as I said, I think within the EU, there are EU member states who are NATO allies that will absolutely want to make sure that this does not detract from NATO increasing spending there, but also interoperability and dialogue within NATO. And I think I really want to reassure the committee in my sort of small capacity that even in Paris, this is something that I hear very regularly. So it won't detract because they don't have the same aims. But I would hope that the EU in European countries, when they think of a project, that they do make that assessment of, does it help NATO in some way, or will it detract it? And if so, then should we go ahead with the project?
One small point. I think you mentioned Trump, and you said that if he gets in, there was a concern that support for Europe might diminish or tail away, which is what he's threatening to do. Hence the significance of PESCO. When I asked my question a moment ago, I don't think you answered it, Georgina, to be fair. I said, what about paying your full whack as a NATO member? Very few do that. Surely that is priority number one before you start spending money on other projects that don't necessarily add anything to NATO and in some cases detract from it.
I mean, I'm not obviously not an EU government. I'm unfortunate to not have that responsibility. I think when you hear about sort of in discussions, expert discussions about Trump potentially returning to power and some of the implications that would have for the US's involvement on European security, the number one thing I hear is, how do we reinforce the European pillar of NATO, not how do we spend more on PESCO? So as I said, I think the EU countries have said they're going to spend more. I really hope that they do at least meet their 2%. Now we're talking about 3% of GDP on defence. That will be a matter and a decision for each individual government. But as I said, I certainly from and again, I don't design PESCO projects. I'm not working for the EU. I don't work for an EU government. But my sense is that they're very aware that this should complement and support NATO, and therefore not detract from it. But it's absolutely an important question, and I don't have the answer. But I would hope that that is something that they're thinking about very lucidly, given the most important security threat, as you said, that we're facing since the Second World War.
Thank you, Chairman.
Yes, thank you. Andrew Jenkins, please.
Thank you. The EU and NATO have acknowledged that a stronger NATO and a stronger EU are mutually reinforcing. What does PESCO offer that is significantly different to NATO? Could I ask you, Dr. Tylecote, first, please?
So by way of answer, I'd also like to allude to some of the things that Miss Wright has said, because I think it is fundamentally different. I agree that it's not the case that PESCO will become a new NATO. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a risk of PESCO supplanting NATO. And I agree with Miss Wright that it is not the intention of member states in general for PESCO to supplant NATO, but it doesn't necessarily need to be at this stage. What do I mean by this? I do believe that there is a risk of PESCO or EU defence harmonisation to some degree supplanting NATO, and I've talked about the comparison of the articles dealing with mutual defence. In the binding requirements of PESCO, whether or not member states are meeting them, there is the discussion about committing spending and harmonising R&D, data sharing, and so on. This is a question about budgets that are already under pressure and where defence budgets go to, where they're dedicated. But to the point of, is it a new NATO and how does it complement or contrast with NATO? Again, Miss Wright mentioned the fact that nations are not somehow dominated by the European Commission in defence decision-making at this stage. While that's true, we have recently had a call from Ursula von der Leyen, among other people, to create an EU Defence Commissioner. So I think, again, with respect to Ms. Wright, she's describing the status quo, but where does the Commission intend to go? And what does this mean for freedom of action, and what does this mean for PESCO? Jens Stoltenberg, NATO Secretary-General, has argued against the existence of an EU Defence Commissioner. Again, he has said this is because it would risk duplicating, not identically, but duplicating NATO structures, and doing so in a I would say, the most closed-door EU body, whose decisions are simply, as a matter of fact, made behind closed doors. We also have to understand the environment in which these proposals are being made. Just some examples of this are that in May 2021, the German foreign minister asked for the national veto to disappear. So this is a question of the extension of QMV, qualified majority voting, not directly a commission issue, but into the defence sphere. So I think there is a risk of not the replication of NATO, but the supplanting of NATO, distraction from NATO, and the centralisation of decision-making over defence questions. Sorry.
Are you aware of what the British government's position is on having this commissioner?
The current position?
Yes.
I believe the current British government is not in favour of this,
okay,
but that's moot as to what
future,
happens in due course.
Exactly. Okay, thank you. Miss Wright, please.
So I'm aware you asked a different question, so I would try to answer that.
Yeah, the first question, so about EU and NATO have acknowledged a stronger NATO and a stronger EU. Yeah.
If I may, just to quickly say, there are a number of member states who aren't very comfortable with this idea of an EU Defence Commissioner, so I'm just going to put it out there. And also, it wouldn't be sort of a duplicate of NATO Secretary General. The idea is to try and support the EU defence industry. So that's really promoting cross-national collaboration, seeing where can the EU support more investment in the defence market? Can the EU put funding towards that? So it would really be those decisions that would fall under this Defence Commissioner, as I understand it, and not sort of, thinking about EU army or rapid deployment or anything like that. But so to come back to the question, I mean, I think the PESCO mobility project is really interesting in this regard. So it was obviously set up in 2018 to facilitate movement of troops and defence equipment across Europe, and it was, and whether that's by road, rail, sea, or air, it's led by the Netherlands. And it really is helpful for NATO as well, because it allows it to rapidly deploy forces across Europe and defence equipment. And like in practice, that means reducing the delays, making the paperwork easier, etc. It also has another element which is quite interesting, is that it provides a sort of political strategic platform, which is this idea of, okay, well, we can reduce paperwork, but how can we try and make our paperwork, how can we standardize paperwork as well, to make sure that cross-border military transport happens more efficiently? What are the how can we protect these transport routes from threats? And there are lots of interesting elements around energy security as well. So there's been some reflection around that. It's open to third country contributions, as you know, and I think that is a good example of how it can complement NATO.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. I'm now going to move to Gavin Robinson, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good afternoon to you both. Perhaps I'll come to you, Mr. Tylecote, first, if that's okay. Given some of the contributions you've made and the challenge to Ms. Wright as well about the future of PESCO and its interaction with NATO, do you have any confidence that PESCO and the strands that it has at the moment will be an exception, or do you see future expansion of PESCO and therefore a threat to NATO?
Well, I think I've expressed my view about the threat to NATO, and I think I should emphasise, I think this is a kind of an indirect supplanting and distraction as far as the threat goes. I'd phrase my answer in two ways. In terms of expansion, there are simply practical questions, and the European Union member states, especially in Eastern Europe, I'm thinking of the Poles and the Czechs above all, are increasingly concerned about what PESCO could mean for their national sovereignty and their freedom of action in national defence. Again, on the practical side, the successes or lack of the military mobility project could tell us that these projects are likely to be limited in success and become bogged down. So I think one way of measuring the success of military mobility could be the money spent, which is so far, I understand, 3.7 billion euros. But on the other hand, what has it achieved? So the projects indeed, as Ms. Wright has said, are largely aimed at improving rail, road and airport capacity. But progress is actually rather slow. And again, I'm happy to submit more written evidence on this in terms of achievements on the ground. And there are some slightly predictable new requirements that I think are bogging down progress and are likely to bog down progress in this area because of the other agendas in which the EU involves itself. So one example here is that the joint communication on a new outlook on climate and security under the EDA will now look at ways that militaries can reduce their fossil fuel reliance. So I think there's likely to be a kind of a bureaucratic drift and levels of bureaucratic distraction. However, we have to keep intention in mind, and the trend in the European Union since the Maastricht Treaty especially has been towards centralisation of decision making. And another example, I mentioned the German foreign minister. Another example is that the High Representative Josep Borrell has also called for the national veto to be removed and unanimity in military decision making to be rendered unnecessary. So it's hard to predict the levels of success, quote unquote, that PESCO will see. But I think these two tensions between member states, especially in Eastern Europe, and a strong centralising intent, particularly under the Commission, will be crucial.
Thank you, Ms. Wright. I saw you nodding parts of that contribution at least, not to tie you in with it all. When asking about PESCO and the potential for expansion, I think you can frame an answer around military mobility in and of itself and its success or lack thereof. But are you aware of emerging pillars for PESCO to consider, new strands that they're seeking partners to develop as a new and alternative form of PESCO achievement or ambition?
So, thank you for that question. No, I mean, I completely agree with what's just been said, which is that actually not, that even if you look at the mobility project, you need to look at how the money is being spent. Is it spent wisely? And I think that is due diligence, and that's why I was nodding enthusiastically, because I think, yes, that absolutely needs to be done to make sure that every euro that is spent in the right way. To answer your question, I'm not aware, but I can certainly look into it. And if I hear anything or find anything, I can submit written evidence around new pillars that could emerge or new projects that could emerge. As I said, it's sort of a 2-year cycle. So every 2 years, there are new projects that are being proposed. What I will say is that we've seen over the past 5 years, the EU do things that we never thought were possible. So talking about industrial policy, the way it has been to, procure vaccines for the whole of the EU, and even sort of support through military, funding a third country that is at war. These were all things that were unheard of. But, it's not the European Commission that is deciding on its own and then imposing it. Member states are very actively involved. And as you are all aware, the Council is formed of 27 member states, of which quite a number of them do not want to see greater centralisation and do not want to see the EU make decisions where, frankly, those decisions are better made at the national level collectively. So I think that is also important when we think of the future, that this isn't just an irreversible path, and actually there is a lot more nuance within the EU, and particularly on issues around defence.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. David Jones, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Ms. Wright, you just mentioned that parts of the advantages of joining the military mobility element of PESCO is the obviation of unnecessary paperwork and bureaucracy. I'm finding this really quite hard to understand because clearly NATO and the European Union have a shared interest in military mobility. The United Kingdom is a prominent member of the NATO alliance. If these arrangements didn't exist, surely it would still be possible for NATO to cross the continent of Europe without someone stopping them at a boundary and saying, papers, please. So I'm finding it hard to see what real value there is there, and I'd like Dr. Tylecote to comment on this too. But one further point which you may be able to assist me with, and that's this. This arrangement, as I understand it, is going to be established by an administrative arrangement, which, as I understand, is still in course of negotiation. Have you any idea as to where that arrangement is in process of negotiation? And what will the legal status of that arrangement be when finally concluded? That's rather a lengthy question, but I hope you can help me with that.
I hope my answer is satisfactory. So on the added value, clearly this is something that NATO can't actually do. And that's why the EU, through this PESCO project, has stepped up and said, well, let's try and think about how we can accelerate, simplify the movement of troops and defence equipment across Europe. And it was, I think, very notable that it was in the 2018, I think, EU-NATO declaration, and repeatedly has been put forward by NATO as one of the only real sort of major deliverables from the EU-NATO cooperation. It's a very interesting question to ask whether NATO would be able to do that, and I'd have to look into it more, but I suspect it would have happened by now if it had been possible. On the administrative arrangements, I don't know where we are in negotiations, and I did, in preparation for this meeting, try and find out. Of course, as you will imagine, this is a legal document. It's obviously going to be negotiated between the EU and the UK government. But what I do know is that it sets out all the legal requirements and also what is expected from parties to the agreement. And that is something that the EU has to feel comfortable with, but of course, first and foremost, the UK. And so I would hope that, whatever stage we are at the negotiations, that the UK government might be able to, in front of the committee or otherwise, shed some light on how far we are in some of the UK requirements and what it would like to see in that agreement before it being.
What will the legal status of that agreement be? Will it have?
It is legally binding, so it is legally. It is a legal document.
How long?
That
Do we know?
sets out. It sets out the terms of the cooperation.
And do we know for how long it will prevail?
Presumably, I mean, I don't know because I haven't seen one of these agreements, but presumably it would, last for the duration of the project, but it would also have an exit clause if possible. But again, I wouldn't know because I'm not sort of privy to.
No, that's fair enough. Dr. Tylecote.
Thank you. So I'll try and answer both of your questions. First on the practical value of military mobility. I think it's important to remember that military mobility as a project exists within and under PESCO. Why was PESCO, springing from the Lisbon Treaty, described as the sleeping beauty of the Lisbon Treaty by then President Juncker? I think let's just ponder that a little bit. It's because PESCO contains binding commitments in 20 areas. And one of these deals with investment expenditure, and these are designed to increasingly harmonise investment expenditure. We've heard an allusion to the European industrial base and so on. In the EDF regulations, and this is why I do want us to ponder growth and prosperity and protectionism, and how even an apparently limited project is a stepping stone towards the development of PESCO. In EDF regulations, it describes that R&D projects, and we assume these will appear as a result of military mobility, will be selected in part on, I quote, their contribution to the autonomy of the European defence technological and industrial base, including by increasing non-dependency on non-union sources. So this is protectionist in intent. It's anti-competitive in intent. And it also discusses, again, happy to submit written evidence, how awards will be made and the closed-door nature of these awards. So that's another area where I think there should be an alarm bell about even apparently ad hoc projects under PESCO. If we could just turn to the administrative arrangement, with respect to what Miss Wright has said, I think it's worth breaking down where that is, at least where I understand that is. So the administrative arrangement clearly warrants proper parliamentary scrutiny. That's the first point. When the UK was accepted into military mobility, the project military mobility in 2022, there wasn't parliamentary debate, and the question is the way open for the UK to be drawn further into EU defence structures? Because we can assume this agreement will deal with the scope of the UK's participation, conditions for its review, the disclosure of sensitive information, and so on. And the issue is, will the commitments be legally binding? And I think the evidence increasingly suggests that they will. When we look at the Council decision in 2020, again coming to you in written evidence, on establishing the general conditions under which third states could exceptionally be invited to participate in individual PESCO projects, such as this, we note language that implies a binding agreement. I'd just like to briefly quote. It states that third states may be exceptionally invited by project participants. They would need to provide substantial added value to the project, contribute to strengthening PESCO and the common security and defence policy, and meet, I emphasise, more demanding commitments. So there are various doors that I think are opening here. You, I think, are about to hear from the Minister and no doubt the status of that agreement and whether it will be made public anytime soon will be a big interest of yours. But I think until we know whether Parliament can scrutinise the administrative agreement and everything that is in it and all its legally binding implications or otherwise, my view is to treat the project with great caution.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're running tight on time at the moment, and we have the Minister coming immediately after you. But I just simply want to wrap up by asking a very direct question, and I want a short answer, if I may. Are we going to have an EU army or not? Just quickly, Dr. Tylecote, have we got the prospect of an EU army as the National Foreign Minister for Italy, Antonio Tajani, suggested recently? That's what he said he wanted. We should have our own army. I mean, not us, but the European Union should have its own army. Yes or no? I mean, can I ask both of you very quickly to answer that question?
Shall I begin?
If you would.
Well, forgive me, I can't quite say yes or no. I can say it remains to be seen, and as concisely as possible, this depends on the two competing dynamics that I've described and how they play out. There is already an embryonic European army in the form of the EU battle groups, and although there is a plan to increase their number from 1,500 to 5,000 personnel by 2025, this is a merely conceptual entity, so it doesn't yet exist. That said, and I refer to my previous comments about the potential commissioner and the general centralising intent, the creation of a functioning EU army would entail and require the full federalisation of the European Union as a bloc.
Georgina, Wright, please, on that question, fairly short if you may.
No, I just don't see it happening. I really don't. From all the discussions I take part in Brussels, you have a small number of people who call for it, and a very large pool of people who don't like the idea, and who don't see the added value. And I think, and this is perhaps for another session on the battle groups, it plays a very distinct role. It's for short missions, and it's in no way having sort of a joint army that can intervene at any point and for long durations.
And I've got one last question, and that is that listening to this discussion, and we have the Minister to come very shortly, if you think about what happened with Ukraine, it happened very quickly. Some of the things that come out of these discussions, I have to say, throughout the whole of our inquiry into this, and it's not just this session, has a slightly unreal quality to it as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I was born on the very day, at the very time when Hitler invaded Holland and France in 1940 on May the 10th. It happened then. These questions and discussions that go on about how it's going to be done, all the administrative arrangements, is it legally binding and the rest of it, have a way of just disappearing in a puff of smoke if somebody does decide preemptive action. Are you satisfied with the state of affairs regarding defence in the EU as well as in the UK and in NATO, that we will be ready if anything unfortunate really did happen and happen quite quickly? Could I ask Radomir Tylecote first of all to answer that question? Or are you concerned, as I am, that there's an awful lot of administrative discussion and may not be enough readiness?
So, thank you. The degree to which I'm dissatisfied with that readiness in this increasingly uncertain world that you describe is because my concern is that there is confusion growing because of the centralisation and the development of EU defence harmonisation about which mechanism would likely lead, and I include the concept of what you would call charismatic authority about where these discussions are happening, and I think for those things to remain in NATO, just because of the growing risk of that kind of eventuality, is increasingly important.
That helps me a lot. And Georgina, Wright, your answer to that question, readiness as compared to administrative arrangements?
I mean, I think we need more focus on readiness. I think and if we can talk about positives in the context of the war in Ukraine, which I find very difficult, but there's more willingness, there's a realization that we need more capabilities and that we need more alliances and partnerships and more dialogue. And I think that is one of the positives that came out of this. And I think actually in sort of 90% of those discussions, it's not about the administrative and the legal requirements, but those are necessary because it is money, it is companies that are going to be producing these arms, and it is normal that there is a minimum amount of time that is spent on that to make sure that these projects are as robust as possible, serve the interests of the parties involved, and actually deliver and a value for money. So I think it is important that those discussions happen, but I absolutely agree that the main focus is, are we ready and how quickly can we be ready?
Well, that's very helpful as a final contribution from both of you, if I may say. Thank you both very much for coming, and we'll move on to the Minister in a moment. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Suspend.
Yeah.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Now, for the second half of this session, I'd very much like to welcome the Minister of State, the Earl of Minto, who is responsible for PESCO, and thank him and his official, Mr. Gareth Williams, for appearing in person to give evidence this afternoon. This very important inquiry has covered multiple areas, including non-EU member state participation in PESCO projects, including the general terms and conditions of participation, and what this could potentially mean for the United Kingdom with regard to the military mobility project. Also included is the UK-EU defence cooperation since Brexit, such as our participation in the military mobility project and the European Defence Fund, and also what PESCO means for defence contractors, specifically British defence companies. Now, these are very important questions to ask regarding PESCO and what it means for the UK's regained sovereignty after Brexit, and what PESCO could potentially lead to, particularly as there seems to have been a lack of scrutiny of the UK's participation in the military mobility project so far, except for this committee. We are hopeful that you can shine a light on some of these issues and help us better to understand the government's actual position on PESCO. So before we begin, Earl Minto, would you be kind enough to introduce yourself?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm Timothy Minto, Minister of State to the Ministry of Defence. May I first thank you for your opening remarks and thank colleagues for inviting me to appear before the European Scrutiny Committee. If you allow, I would like to offer a few words of my own to help set the scene from our perspective, and then, of course, Gareth Williams and I look forward to getting into the detail of your questions. To contextualise today's discussion on PESCO, the EU's Permanent Structured Cooperation on Defence and Security project, I feel it's worth us all remembering in the back of our minds that the UK and the EU member states, not to mention many other global partners, share common security challenges in what has evidently become a less stable world. As all in this room will appreciate, the illegal Russian invasion of Ukraine has brought this into sharp relief. From coordinating sanctions to the supply of equipment, ammunition and training support, the UK and EU members have proven once again our ability and indeed our need to work very closely together. Of course, the EU as an institution should be careful not to replicate the focus, structure or expertise of NATO, which, it will come as no surprise to you to hear me to say this, remains the bedrock and primacy of the Euro-Atlantic defence, but rather each organisation should play to its respective strengths. And for the avoidance of doubt, we do not assess PESCO as a threat to the primacy of NATO. The military mobility project, in particular, addresses the bureaucracy of moving personnel and equipment around Europe, and we view this as complementary to NATO objectives. I believe this is a view shared by many in previous evidence given to this committee, but of course I defer to your questions in an effort to reassure you further of the government's position, Mr. Chairman.
That's extremely helpful. Thank you very much. In December 2020, I'll ask the first question. In December 2020, the then Secretary of State for Defence, Ben Wallace, stated that the UK had no plans to participate in PESCO projects. In 2022, he said that the UK should look at joining the military mobility project. Can you tell us what PESCO is and what has changed between 2020 and the present time, 2023, which means that the government wants to participate in the military mobility project, and what are the headline benefits of the UK's participation in PESCO projects, and on the other hand, the trade-offs? That's the question.
Right. I mean, PESCO, as I'm sure committee members will know, is a series of individual projects which do not overlap. They are specific in purpose, and they address particularly the issues that address their particular subjects. The military mobility one is one which is not designed to do with anything with procurement or military capability, but the ability to move troops and equipment around Europe at speed. I suppose what has changed since 2020 and 2022 is the fact that Ukraine has come onto the scene and made what was a perfectly reasonable plan slightly more pressing.
Good. Next question, Andrea Jenkins, please.
Thank you, Chairman. The government is currently negotiating an administrative arrangement with the EU concerning the UK's participation in the PESCO military project. When finalised, can we have access to the document?
Absolutely.
Yes. Yep, good. And will you commit to submitting the arrangement for parliamentary scrutiny?
I think perhaps I better just temper what I said. I think we should take a look and see where we are at that particular time. I mean, I'd like to say that the administrative arrangements are memoranda, so they're not legally binding. But so I think it's not necessarily suitable for parliamentary scrutiny.
David Jones.
If I could just pick you up on that point, Lord Minto, you said that they're not legally binding. That wasn't what we were just told by Georgina Wright.
Yes, I mean, I heard that because I was in the room. I mean,
she's wrong.
Well, I mean, I believe that they are not legally binding.
Well, forgive me, you believe that. Mr. Williams, what will the status of this arrangement be? Will it be a binding, enforceable arrangement?
No, it is a memorandum of understanding,
right.
And it is not legally binding.
So Miss Wright was wrong in her evidence?
I'm afraid I did not hear Miss Wright's evidence, so I'm unable to comment on what she said, but I can only comment on our understanding of the arrangement and in everything that we've been doing on it. It is a non-legally binding memorandum of understanding.
There's something from which we can withdraw, therefore, at any time.
It does not provide any legal commitments.
And with respect, sorry,
that's what I actually asked. We can withdraw from it at any time.
Yes, and we can participate. We can choose to participate in any parts of the project that we might choose to, and choose not to participate in others. It does not tie our hands. It does not bind us into any wider form of cooperation. So it does not tie us into anything.
Thank you.
Going back to a point which I made in the previous session, readiness, and the question of whether or not we would want to cooperate if indeed something dreadful did happen, is right at the heart of the question, because when you're dealing with questions of defence, as we appreciate from past experience, these things can happen, if they do, as in the case of Ukraine, at very short notice. And therefore, although it's very interesting to know whether we're going to have access to documents or whether we're going to have parliamentary scrutiny, the real question, surely at the heart of it, is are we ready for whatever might happen in the unfortunate event that it was going to be generated from outside the European Union and NATO itself. So if you'd like to comment on it in that context, because I think a lot of people who are aware, as you quite rightly said earlier, Minister, that the situation since Ukraine has become more poignant and perhaps more immediate, without making any alarming statements. Nonetheless, readiness is everything. So the real question I'd like to press on you is, can you answer my question as I put it to the previous panel? Are we in fact going to be ready if indeed anything unfortunate was to happen?
I mean, it's an extremely good point, Mr. Chairman. I mean, I think that the situation is that if we did have the military mobility agreement in place, then we would be considerably more ready than we are now. Having said that, one has to believe that pragmatism would rule the day and that one would be able to move swiftly if there was a threat such as you propose.
And would you agree with that? I'm sure you would, but I'd just like to hear your confirmation.
Yes, absolutely. You'll be aware that plans are, all plans and procedures are in place via NATO to ensure the deterrence and defence of the Euro-Atlantic area, and we have confidence in those plans.
That's very helpful. I was going to say we have two members of the Defence Committee on this committee as it happens, so I'm sure that when they ask their questions they will form their own judgment wearing two hats and not just the one. But thank you very much for that. So the next question, Gavin Robinson, please.
Thank you, Chair. And I'm going to don a third hat, if that's okay, and that's a former career in law. So just, Mr. Williams, I think you're being careful and appropriately so about the words you use when talking about the legal enforceability of a memorandum of understanding. Are you indicating to the committee that a memorandum of understanding cannot contain legally enforceable commitments, or are you indicating to us prior to the conclusion of the negotiations that the memorandum of understanding you are going to sign does not have any legally enforceable conditions?
I am just commenting on the administrative, on the memorandum of understanding, the administrative agreement as it would apply to this situation. So,
in the knowledge of the contents of it, or in the abstract?
And in the framework that we have, that has been discussed with regards to cooperation in this project.
Because of course a memorandum of understanding could contain contractual obligations, and the memorandum of understanding could be construed as a contract between the parties attached to it, yes?
Yes, as I said, in this situation, I'm commenting on the arrangement as it applies to PESCO military mobility, rather than in generalities around memoranda or memoranda of understanding in general.
Earl of Minto, good to see you. You'd indicated in an earlier contribution that you did not feel there was a necessity for parliamentary scrutiny. So I'd like to explore that just slightly further, if I may. Obviously, Parliament's role is to scrutinise. That's what we do.
I understand that,
yes. So are you delineating between scrutiny and providing approval? Or do you believe we should have no role in scrutinising at all the agreements that the executive enter into?
No, I don't think that was an intention I was implying. I think that there is. The question was that you just put. I'm not certain that it is necessary for parliamentary scrutiny.
The question that was asked by Ms Jenkins when she was here was, will you commit to submitting the arrangement for parliamentary scrutiny?
I think the answer
You're indicating you don't feel that that's necessary.
I think that's right.
And Parliament would always reserve the right to scrutinise whatever the executive does. I think you would accept that's our role. But you don't believe that this is something for which government will be seeking a motion of approval or a debate around, or the content of which should be subject to scrutiny within Parliament?
Yeah, so I think, just to jump here, I think joining this project sits firmly within the government's competence, and there is no requirement to consult Parliament, as I understand it, on the non-binding arrangements such as these. And I think that's the key point here. Because this is a non-legally binding Memorandum of Understanding, Section 21 of the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act does not apply, as that only applies to formal treaties. So just to be really clear, joining this does not in any way legally bind us to the EU. But I would note that we have very much welcomed the opportunity to provide written and oral evidence to support the scrutiny process here, including a discussion in the House of Commons on the topic. But when it comes to publishing the administrative arrangement itself, it isn't MOD policy to publish MOUs because they often contain classified military or technical details that are not suitable for wider publication.
I think that's a fair distinction between our role in scrutiny and the requirement or otherwise, whether it's desirable or not, to seek Parliament's approval for entering into such an arrangement. I think that's what you're indicating is not required. You do not require Parliament's approval. But I think there is a sense that the structures around our ability to scrutinise perhaps aren't as strong as they ought to be. That's not to say we need to give permission, but at least we can fulfil our constitutional role of challenge. So very keen to hear, Earl of Minto, whether you believe what is envisaged for parliamentary scrutiny is as sufficient as it should be, because you've heard the nature of the questions in the earlier session and you understand some of the wider context around these relationships.
No, I understand
you believe
that.
There should be a willingness to engage in thorough scrutiny short of approval.
Yes, I don't think I was trying to indicate there was anything that we were unwilling, but I think the point that I was trying to make was that it was unnecessary and not required.
Thank you, Chairman.
Okay, thank you very much. David Jones, please.
Thank you, Chairman. If I could just pursue that last point a little further. Does the European Union also regard this arrangement, administrative arrangement, as a memorandum of understanding? In other words, do they have the same assessment of its legal effect or otherwise?
Yes, I believe so.
They do. The document is not available for anyone to read publicly. Is there any particular reason apart from the technical points that Mr. Williams has mentioned?
My understanding is still under negotiation, so it's not available yet.
When it's negotiated, will it be available?
No, I don't think it will be for the reasons that Mr. Williams explained.
I mean, it's odd because we've had evidence from a member of the Norwegian government, which of course is also participating in the military mobility element
as a third country, yes.
Yes. He told us that the arrangement they'd entered into with the European Union was readily available on the government website. Is there any reason why that should be the case in Norway but not in the United Kingdom?
I think that is clearly a matter for the government of Norway. As stated, unfortunately, it's not MOD policy to publish such memoranda of understanding due to their non-binding nature.
You understand why this committee finds it frustrating that we're spending several sessions talking about an arrangement that we're unable to read?
Well, I can see that, yes.
Can you explain then what are the rights and obligations of a non-EU country joining a PESCO project?
Well, a third country joining a PESCO project have to be invited to do so. They have rights to be involved within the decision-making process. They have rights to contribute where level. What they do not have is the power of veto, and what they do not have is the same level of rights that the member states have.
In what sense? You say the same level of rights?
That if a decision is taken, and it needs to be unanimous, if the EU states agree and the third country or a number of third countries disagree, then that the EU states have the right of decision.
But in those circumstances, as Mr. Williams has made clear, we can simply withdraw from the arrangement.
That's absolutely correct.
So the word permanent is something that I think causes some concern again in the committee. Permanent structured cooperation. It doesn't seem to me it's permanent at all.
I think as a third country, it's not.
Thank you very much.
Greg Smith, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Minister, can you inform the committee, as this should be a yes-no question before I come on to the bulk of it, do the obligations for joining PESCO projects in any way, shape or form compromise our Brexit freedoms?
No.
It's a clear no. Good. So who will have ultimate decision-making authority over the military mobility project? And inherent to that and inherent to United Kingdom sovereignty, will the United Kingdom be able to exercise a veto over how it is run and administered?
No, the United Kingdom will not be able to exercise the veto as a third party. And on this particular project, we have the United States, Canada and Norway already in as third parties. And they don't have that. They don't have that right either.
And so a project that the United Kingdom, in a legally non-binding way,
yes,
signs up to, a country that is now sovereign again, aren't then stop it if it doesn't actually like the way that particular project.
No, they can. No, the third country can withdraw, but it can't stop it.
We could completely, without penalty, withdraw all of our, be it personnel or whatever it might be, from any particular project.
I think, yeah.
Could I just make a clarification here around the PESCO military mobility project, because it is very much different to all of the other PESCO projects, which is why this is the only one that is currently under consideration for joining, in that it doesn't involve procurement, it doesn't involve research or capability development or any form of funding. It is a forum for discussion and alignment of principles, processes, regulations to enable the smooth movement of military personnel and equipment. So in this situation, as it applies, as your question applies to the military mobility project, rather than necessarily PESCO as a whole, because I think it is important to separate out the one that we're talking about joining and the wider set. There are not situations where we can envisage there being things being done that we would things proceeding in a direction that we would then want to move them back from. It's, as I say, this is a forum for consultation and considering and sharing with like-minded allies, and this is exactly why the US, Canada and Norway, as we understand it, are participating in this, because of the value of that forum. So there are not hard things that come out of it in terms of capability development or intellectual property, which then would trigger the problems that we know exist regarding third-party participation in wider projects.
But if that forum, to try and boil this down to its lowest common denominator, if that forum, which you've just said, can agree processes, if a process is agreed within that forum for whatever it might be, the movement of tanks or whatever it is, that then the United Kingdom sovereign government decides we don't like that process, we are not going to play with that process, what happens? We just simply have to leave the whole thing? We just don't agree it within the mobility forum? That's the scenario. We don't agree with the process. Let's say even the Americans want to do it with the French and so on as well, but we don't agree. What happens?
There is nothing in that participation in this project binds us to. It is a forum for discussion and to ensure that when things are being discussed and the EU is thinking about its internal processes on this, that we are able to feed in UK requirements and hope to shape things that are taking place there. So this is a mechanism to shape existing discussions, to shape processes, not something that binds the UK to behave in a certain way. It's about aligning with requirements that we have, so it's a mechanism of influence rather than something that ties us to a course of action.
We have a military member of the committee. In fact, we have two here at the moment. Adam Holloway, would you like to ask the next question? I think you had something, you looked as if you wanted to intervene.
Yeah, sorry, I mean, it's not particularly detailed, but I don't understand why non-EU countries are getting into an EU arrangement when we're all already members of NATO. Why have the Americans and the Canadians and the Norwegians and now ourselves, why are we doing it through the EU? I thought the NATO was what we used to defend ourselves in Europe. I mean, it's all NATO equipment that's being moved.
Yes, I mean, you're absolutely right. NATO is the primacy. I think that what the PESCO project is trying to do is to provide is trying to reduce the amount of bureaucracy, to simplify and standardise the cross-border military transport procedures, and as such, it's a pragmatic exercise, and I think it should be of benefit to NATO as a whole. It's complementary to NATO. It's certainly not trying to compete with NATO.
Yeah, no, I don't see why it would have to be through the EU. I suppose all the countries that this material would move through would be EU countries, but then they're all members of NATO anyway.
So from NATO's perspective, NATO views this as an important initiative, views it as complementary. It's specifically referenced in the NATO-EU declaration as an area where they are working closely on it. So this is how NATO is choosing to do or to address some of these elements, is through cooperation with the EU. There are elements that fall within NATO competence, and there are areas that fall within where the EU is well suited, particularly given its regulatory and budgetary powers, to support military mobility and all. So I think a lot of it comes down to the powers and levers that the organisations have, which is why it's a complementary activity.
Can I just postulate a position which is related to our being an island? Some say the sceptred isle, etc. we are in a very different position, actually, with the exception of Ireland, to the rest of Europe. And when we're talking about tanks going across plains or whatever they happen to be, of course it's a completely different story. I mean, the United Kingdom, certainly as regards the mainland here, Great Britain, has a border which is a sea. And therefore, the idea of crossing borders, and somebody mentioned it just now in tanks, doesn't quite apply in the same way for us as it does for us. When you're talking about military mobility, there is also the question of naval mobility. And I'm just interested to know whether the word military mobility includes the Navy, because one of the things that we do need to be quite sure about is that we have an adequate naval force to repel, as we have so often in the past, any potential invasion if it were to occur. And of course, against that background, there are also much more sophisticated missile operations and so forth. So without getting into too much detail, are you satisfied that we are in a position to do what the military mobility would amount to, taking account of the fact that we're an island as compared to the rest of the mainland of Europe? You see my point?
Absolutely.
It just seems to be quite a practical question.
Yes.
You can't move tanks across a sea in the same way as you can obviously fly aeroplanes or use the naval ships and things of that kind. Can you just throw some light on this? I'm trying to sort of get to the bottom of how the word military mobility would actually turn into a reality.
I mean, my view is that this is primarily about borders and about moving ground troops in case of a disaster that might appear, and as I say, ironing out all the democracy that all the bureaucracy that one can to make it simple. As far as the Navy is concerned, I have to admit, I'm not certain. Is the Navy covered by what we're talking about?
Yeah, I think in that specific question, I'm not sure we're well placed to answer that particular question on right now. But I think it's safe to say as it pertains to PESCO in the military mobility project, my understanding is that being inside the project, you can shape and seek to guide what the focus of the project is. So, and I believe you heard in your previous evidence from one of the from a Norwegian official that their assessment was that third countries have a relatively good say on how projects are run. So I think in terms of shaping the project, being inside it would enable us to hopefully make sure it's focused on the things that we want, notwithstanding the caveats earlier around the UK not having a veto on it specifically, but in terms of shaping those discussions.
Just to wrap this up, I mean, I just simply I'm not going to actually ask you to answer the question across the table here right now, but I would be grateful if you could send me or send the committee an answer to the question what the word military means in this context. Because if it does include Navy, if it does include aircraft, etc., it's a different kind of business. If it's actually purely related to the military, i.e. troops on the ground, tanks, all that sort of thing, it's a different story. So without elaborating on this now, I'd be grateful if you could just give us a sort of pen sketch of what it is meant to, because we haven't seen this document, we're not quite sure what it means. Okay, so Richard Drax, would you be kind enough to ask the next question, please?
Thank you. Good afternoon to you both. Just quickly before I do, you were in the room before, so you heard the previous session. Minister?
Just the last question.
Okay. The point I raised with Georgina was that, in my view, there is a risk of PESCO detracting from NATO, which is, as we all agree, is the prime force for the defence. You said, Mr. Williams, talking about consultation and sharing, I'm proud to say I'm a Brexiteer and I'm instinctively untrustworthy of anything EU. And I worry that this PESCO project is going to detract rather than add to NATO when most members of NATO don't even pay their basic dues. We were in Italy, Naples, at Joint Force Command's southern area, and we met the brigadier, whoever he was, in charge of logistics, interestingly. And I said to him, what's your job? And he said, my job is to ensure that if a train goes from the west coast of France, it can get to the fighting area if indeed our opponent is Russia. And all the things you're talking about. So that's exactly what his job was doing, and he told us that it was proving a nightmare, not least within the EU, because the 27 of them, and as we all know, to make a decision takes them months. Maybe war would speed that up, God forbid. So the point I'm just trying to make is that efforts are already being made within NATO to do exactly what this project is trying to do. And I can't see this project helping NATO when they're not even paying their full dues as members of it. Is that an unfair assessment? Or are you equally concerned?
I mean, my view is that it can only improve things because it is specifically targeted at trying to ease the progress through boundaries across Europe.
Okay.
And it does not compete with NATO.
Does that include the Euro tunnel by the chance?
Well, I was wondering about that when, Mr. Chairman, you were talking about the island. I was, quite a lot presumably would go through the tunnel. But I presume it would include the tunnel. Yeah.
I think it probably would, I suspect. Yeah. On to my question, in written evidence from the government, we were told that the financial implications of joining PESCO's military mobility project are limited. Can you confirm this today?
Yes, it is very limited. It's literally just the cost of getting somebody to attend the meetings.
And if this changes, will the House be informed? Will the House be told that it's going to actually cost another £10 million?
I just can't imagine a situation where that would occur. But if the situation does change, of course, we will bring it back.
We are dealing with the EU minister who tend to want our money. In a previous evidence session, we were told that, quote, military mobility has been hailed as the flagship of EU-NATO cooperation. Why is it that NATO cannot coordinate military mobility without the EU? Which actually goes back to the point I was making. But it rather picks up on that point. But I suppose the question is, why can't NATO do it? And I think your answer was, I'm paraphrasing, that this is helping NATO do just that.
That's right. Yes.
And you've got nothing more
not compete. Well, I don't think
really.
I don't think PESCO is a threat to NATO's primacy. I really don't. I think it is an administrative process in trying to, as I say, to reduce bureaucracy, to make certain that should the situation arise, that we can move across mainland Europe fast.
Just to pick up my colleague's point about not seeing the deal as such, which does seem extraordinary, will we learn how this is all progressing? If we don't know exactly what we're signing up to, will we be briefed, well, it's all going swimmingly? For example, we've now got trains going from one side of Europe to the other, no problem at all. We've now got frozen areas of deep freeze for blood in the event of a major war. All the sort of logistical issues. We've got ammunition dumps, we've got this, we've got that. It's all fine. Will we hear about this?
I think the thing to sort of note here with this particular project, this PESCO project, it's a long-running project with no specific end date because it is designed to improve and cohere and to basically make sure that everything is running smoothly. And I think coming back to your previous point, this sort of focuses on the fact that both NATO and allies and you can recognise that there is an area, there is a competence for the EU here, and there's a significant role that they can play in supporting and improving Europe's military mobility that is complementary to NATO. So I think it's about having those 2 points together. But this project doesn't have a specific end date.
I understand that, but will we in the House be told that the money we've given, however much it is, to do whatever we won't know what they're doing the money with, we'll be told, yes, in this year we've connected 100 miles of railway, or we've...
Just to clarify a couple of points here, there will be no, under this project, there is no money exchanging hands. I further the point that the Minister made in terms of the only financial commitment here is to attend the meetings, because these meetings are discussions about aligning activity that is separately going on and being funded by the EU has its own military mobility project that is focused on funding, building roads.
Will we hear how the activity is going?
So those are matters for the EU's project. As our participation in this project, in PESCO military mobility, that is around, it's a forum for discussion around those.
I understand that. So we'll have a representative there. Will we hear back in the House how that meeting went and what progress, if any, like getting better rail connection, how it's going?
I mean, in terms of that process, in terms of the process for updating, I don't think there will be on this project alone, a standing process for providing updates to Parliament. But I would imagine it would fall under the normal process of parliamentary scrutiny in the routine interactions between Parliament and the government.
And we're at a slight disadvantage in one sense, which is that we're doing something which we rather would have expected the Defence Committee to have been inquiring into quite a long time ago. And we came to the conclusion that what we really wanted to do was to see in the European context how this would function. And we're getting somewhere, but it's quite difficult without the document. I'm sure you understand that. But, I mean, the other question, if I may, unless you wanted to pursue that line of questioning.
I've finished, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, here's one question, which I don't think we really know quite what the answer to this is. Specifically and very shortly, does the government have any plans to join any other PESCO projects? I think there were 68 or there were 67.
There are a total of 68 discrete projects.
Yes. So, are there plans to join any more? I said plans to join any more, or not?
Not.
Not. Okay. And on the basis that the answer is not, can I say why not?
I think it's, I mean, the interesting thing about this particular project is that it is, like all others, discrete, but it seems to be the one that most third-party countries want to be involved in because of its obvious effectiveness. And while any other project is not so defined.
Everything that I'm hearing suggests that it's a very wise decision not to do so. But David Jones, what's your...
Yes, really, on that point, you said there are no plans to join any other element of PESCO. I actually raised this with Minister Heapy on the floor of the House some time ago. And he said that the government would consider each element on its own merits and make decisions then. So
well, I think that. But I was asked if there are any plans now. There aren't any plans now.
You're not ruling them out.
I think one will be foolish when it comes to European defence to rule out things like that.
One thing you could possibly explain, you mentioned the need for complementarity between the European Union and NATO.
Yes.
And alignment and so on. Well, the United Kingdom, of course, is a member of NATO, prominent member of NATO. Why does it need to have a separate arrangement with the European Union from NATO?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think not all European countries are in NATO, not all NATO countries are European. So I think there's a complementarity that that ensures cover.
Yes, but why can't that arrangement be put in place by NATO? Why does the UK have to have an entirely separate arrangement? Surely NATO could make these arrangements with the European Union and we could just enjoy the benefit of that NATO arrangement.
My understanding is that. Do you want to answer?
Well, I think NATO does believe that cooperation between NATO and the EU, i.e. via PESCO, is an important it's an important
No,
plank.
I fully understand that, but why do we need to have a separate arrangement from the arrangement that NATO has with the EU?
That is the way it is structured in terms of this particular PESCO dialogue is structured as a dialogue with other members and a sort of a parallel complementary forum for discussion on this matter.
It seems unnecessarily complicated. Surely NATO could simply have that arrangement directly with the EU. I just can't understand why we need to have a totally separate arrangement in respect to the United Kingdom or any other third country, really.
I think the benefits of the benefits of being able to participate in these discussions, which are addressing, just reiterating, emphasised on implementing or sort of overcoming impediments to military, to moving things around.
I understand that, but that's something that NATO could negotiate. It doesn't need to have a separate arrangement with the United Kingdom. Have you had some inspiration?
Yes, I have had some helpful inspiration here in the sense that actually it's helpful to clarify that there is actually under PESCO no agreement with the EU. The agreements that we're talking about.
No agreement
here,
with NATO.
Yes, so I've just to come back in terms of here. This is not the UK having an agreement with the EU.
I see.
It is individual agreements with the members to participate on this project. So this is not
So each member state that participates in this will be a separate signatory to this arrangement. Is that right?
Yes, there is an arrangement with each of the individual parties.
Not the European Union.
And as I understand it, no.
I find that extraordinary because no one has ever suggested that previously. I thought that this was an arrangement with the European Union.
No, I believe that is not the case.
Right, okay, thank you.
Right. So have in mind, Greg Smith, if you'd like to ask the question relating to the Defence Fund, because that...
Yeah. So this is another element that we have heard evidence of from previous witnesses on this inquiry, that UK participation in the European Defence Fund could be a possibility if protections are put in place and certain restrictions around intellectual property rights. But of course, participation in the EDF would have European Court of Justice oversight. So can you give the committee an assurance that the United Kingdom is not looking to participate in the European Defence Fund, difficult as that would be given the existing restrictions around who can be a member? But if it is on the table, how on earth would you square that with our sovereignty having left the European Union with the ECJ oversight?
I think we acknowledge the benefits of many EU initiatives, including those which particularly centre on the provision of munitions and equipment to Ukraine and efforts to replenish the stockpiles of allies and partners. Any proposals to boost European industrial capacity and resilience for the long term, we can acknowledge the benefits of those. However, at the moment, the UK government assesses that UK interests are sufficiently managed through NATO and through the bilateral agreements that we have, and via the informal relationship that we have with the European Union, European Defence Agency at this time. So, yeah.
It's completely off the table. It's membership of the European Defence Fund.
It's not currently under consideration.
Okay, that's clear.
It is, and it does seem to, certainly to me, in the form of a question, that are we not looking at something which is a sort of set of attempts to cooperate, but without necessarily being enmeshed? Would that be a reasonable way of describing it? In other words, there is an intention to cooperate. What I'm worried about, as you gather from perhaps my former question, is that when you're confronted with an emergency situation, the last thing you want to be doing is pouring through documents to see what your legal status is, what you're committed to, and so on. Generals and admirals and RAF marshals and the rest of it have to make decisions about what happens when the worst occurs, if it does. And it's the clarity that comes from sovereignty which enables you to be able to make those decisions. And the more complicated, we're used to NATO. 1949 was when it was first, we've grown up with it. The question of whether or not we want a complicated addition as a sort of add-on, like bells and whistles, may be understood in terms of an attempt to cooperate and to move stuff around Europe, and I understand that point about borders there, although I still maintain my concern about the fact that we, being an island, are in a rather different capacity. But am I more or less right in saying that it's an attempt to cooperate in a framework which is fairly flexible, and not to be, as it were, regarded in a nutshell as a substitute for NATO, because you've ruled that out already, and therefore that is quite clear. So when you disaggregate all this, you're really left with something which is not an aspiration, but has a degree of cooperation about it. And if there were to be a change of government, for example, do you have any sort of sense about the direction in which all this might go?
My view, Mr. Chairman, is that the word cooperation that you used several times is absolutely the right one. And this is about cooperating with our allies to ensure that the complementarity alongside NATO is there to make any rapid deployment as free and easy as possible.
No, David.
Yes, if I could just get back to the point I raised with Mr. Williams some time ago, where he told me that the individual participant member states would be entering into this arrangement with the UK. What role does the Council have in connection with this? Is it not the case that the Council has to sign this arrangement off?
Well, I will need to write to you to confirm. We'll need to write to you to confirm exactly.
I think that's quite important, because that would make it clear that this was an EU arrangement with the UK, rather than simply a case of individual participating member states. So I think that is really important, and if you could let us have that information as soon as possible, I'd be very, very grateful.
And if I may say, by a supplement to that question, that we were discussing a little earlier the comments made by the I think it was Madame von der Leyen about the idea of a defence commissioner, or was it who was the other?
Von der Leyen.
So once she's involved as a member of the European Commission, and they're talking about a special role for a European Defence Commissioner, you're getting into very deep water in terms of the legalities. And so I think, David, if you're... do you want to follow up on that?
We need that evidence supplemented in writing, please.
Can I just confirm that I've just consulted with colleagues and can confirm that we will not sign as part of this. There is no signing of an arrangement with the European Defence Agency as part of this. It's just agreements with the individual members.
And does this require approval and sign-off by the Council?
I believe that has already happened.
Well, it can't be, because it hasn't been negotiated.
In terms of we have already been invited.
No, I understand
into
that.
The project.
I understand that, but I'm talking about the final arrangement once it's concluded.
I do not believe that there is any.
Could you write to confirm that, please?
Yes.
Thank you.
Just to pick up on a previous point around the EDF, just to sort of clarify there, I think it's important to remember that full third-party involvement in the EDF is limited to countries within the EEA. And whilst other entities third countries can participate, there are no such arrangements in place at the moment. And as with other EU defence industrial rules, we have significant concerns regarding those third-party rules. Therefore, our assessment currently is that the provisions on EDF for third-party involvement would not meet what we or UK industry needs. So that's just sort of a helpful bit of additional context to that question.
Can you just clarify within that the oversight of the European Court of Justice plays a significant part in the government's assessment of why it doesn't meet our needs, because it would re-challenge our sovereignty?
The focus that I was talking about here is regarding the terms for third-party industry, third-party cooperation, more related to industrial exports and intellectual property. I'm unable to comment right now on
Are you ruling out any role of the European Court of Justice in these arrangements altogether?
That's not something I'm able to comment on at this moment.
Well, surely it must be ruled out because it's a non-binding arrangement.
Well, that's my view, but it's not a question of what we think, it's a matter of what they answer.
Well, I think that's another point upon which we need clarification, Chairman.
Yes. Because once the word European Court of Justice comes into the equation, you're talking about another infringement of sovereignty, which is one of the fundamental questions about Brexit, of course. So if you could consider that, perhaps go back to your lawyers and ask them if they'd be kind enough to give us an answer to that.
We'll do that.
And in that context, on the final question that I think we could ask this afternoon, have the government considered to what extent, if any, British defence companies stand to gain from UK participation in PESCO projects? Is that part of this cooperation, and is there any greater opportunity for us to participate or not? I mean, it might not be a consideration, but I'd just like to know the answer to that question.
My view is that through this particular project, the answer is no. But elsewhere, of course, where there is a lot of activity on cooperation on defence and munitions construction.
I think in conclusion, one might draw sort of a line under the issue. We're not really very fully engaged in PESCO as a whole. There are potentials, but there is no commitment. There is a lack of uncertainty, or there is a lack of certainty about the nature of the legal relationship, which I think you can help us with when you come back to us on that. And basically, I think, speaking for myself, it would seem to me that the minimal degree with which we're going to be involved in this, from what we've been told, would suggest that we ought to be thinking very clearly about our relationship with NATO and making sure that we get the best possible outcome from our relationship with NATO, and be somewhat less concerned about PESCO because it's not going to be a project that we're going to be fully engaged in all its respects. Would that be a fair conclusion?
I think it's fair to say that the PESCO project is distinct from the others in the fact that it does not trigger the things that we have concerns about, because it does not involve procurement or making anything. So I think that is an absolutely fair assessment. I think just to pick up on the point around the legal arrangements involved here, I think it's just to flag that to participate in a project, the third country must have an agreement in place to exchange information with the EU via an administrative arrangement with the project members. And so the UK and the EU already have a wider security of information arrangement in place that came out the back of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. So the only thing that we need to participate in the military mobility project is for an agreement with the project members. there is no role. It is not legally binding. There's no role for the courts in this. So I think we can clarify.
It's bad enough to have a fog of war if war were to ever break out. What would be even more difficult is if we had a fog in the preparation of war. That's one of the thoughts that comes to my mind anyway. But look, I mean, has anybody else got any further questions they'd like to ask? No? Well, thank you very much indeed for your participation this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much
I think
indeed.
we've cleared up one or two points.
Good,
and
I
we've
hope
still
so.
got one or two outstanding matters
Yes.
on which we look forward to receiving some written answers. Thank you.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.